Good day, young philosophers. Today we are going to continue our discussion on the nature of truth. We have mentioned in our teleconference that there are different theories on the nature of truth, and one of these theories is fallacies. And under fallacies, we have three groups. We have linguistic manipulation, psychological warfare, and logical maneuver. We have mentioned in our discussion that linguistic manipulation is the group of fallacies that exploit the connotative fluidity of language in order to simply mislead others. Psychological warfare refers to the fallacies which targets the sensuousness, emotions, and subconscious drives and motivations of human beings. For today, we are going to focus on the third group of fallacies, which is the logical maneuver. The third group of fallacies that we are going to study is the logical maneuvers. We have defined this group of fallacies as the group of fallacies that aim to fool or deceive the cognitive and intellectual aspect of the human mind. Hence, this group of fallacies requires some degree of rhetorical skill and a certain competence in the logical procedures. Rhetoric is an art of persuasion, and it is designed to overpower an audience and bring them over to the point of view of the speaker. This group includes fallacy of composition, fallacy of division, fallacy of dilemma, argument of beard, the straw man, slippery slope, diversion, begging the question, appeal to ignorance, contradictory assumption, two wrongs make a right, and lifting out of context. The first type of logical maneuver is fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition behaves like an inductive argument. So when we say inductive argument, we go to the particular or to the parts of the whole to the whole itself. From the observation of each particular member of an organized whole, it moves to the whole itself. The fallacy of composition is committed when one reasons from the qualities of the parts of the whole to the qualities of the whole itself. So for example, every part of this machine is light in weight. Therefore, the whole machine is light in weight. This fallacy points that if each of the member of a given group has a particular characteristic feature, then the group as a whole has the same characteristic feature. The fallacy of composition overlooks the fact that the group might have other characteristics not found among its individual members due to the factors of organization, synergy, and Gestalt principle. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Gestalt principle looks at the human mind and behavior as a whole. According to Gestalt psychology, we do not simply focus on every small component. Rather, we perceive objects as part of a greater whole and as elements of a more complex system. For instance, if Sir Jed, Sir Mark, and Ma'am Roan are good vocalists, and you assume that their trio must also be good, you commit this fallacy. Another example, atoms of a penny are not visible to the naked eye. Therefore, a penny is not visible to the naked eye. If all the atoms that constitute this penny are invincible, it doesn't follow that the penny is also invincible. The next type of logical maneuver is the fallacy of division, which is the opposite of the fallacy of composition. And this fallacy behaves like a deductive categorical argument. So from the observation of the organized whole, it moves to each particular member or parts of the whole. This fallacy points out that if a given group as a whole has a particular characteristic feature, then each of its members has the same characteristic feature. This fallacy is committed when one reasons from the qualities of a whole to the qualities of the parts of the whole. For example, Filipino cultural minorities are disappearing. One is a Filipino cultural minority, therefore one is disappearing. Another example, we know that Philippines is an economically poor country, but it is wrong to say that therefore Juan de la Cruz, who is from Philippines, is poor. The third type of logical maneuver is false dilemma. The fallacy of false dilemma or the black and white fallacy operates in the following manner. First, it faces the various alternatives in between two extreme alternatives in a particular issue. A false dilemma presents a choice between two mutually exclusive options or the extreme alternatives, implying that there are no other options. In this, one option is clearly worse than the other, making the choice seem obvious. In this, a faulty argument is used to persuade an audience to agree. They can be deliberate or accidental, but their goal is to make their argument convincing. In this, faulty argument is used to persuade an audience to agree. They can be deliberate or accidental, but their goal is to make their argument convincing. Derek Volk, a former president of Harvard University, used this fallacy when he said, "If you think education is expensive, try ignorance." In here, he disregarded the other learning alternatives in between expensive formal education and zero-expense ignorance, so he used two extreme alternatives instead. It presents a black and white kind of thinking when there are actually many shades of gray. The most famous recent example of this fallacy is the following quote. When we tend to think in terms of extreme points, we become vulnerable to this fallacy. When a thing is not white, it is wrong to make the conclusion that it is black. Or when a certain deed is not good, it doesn't mean that it is evil. We should not overlook the basic fact that aside from the opposite extremes, there are most often several other alternative courses of action. The fourth type of logical maneuver is the argument of the beard. If the fallacy of false dilemma conceals the various shades and the middle ground and leaves us only with the opposite extremes, the fallacy of the argument of the beard does the opposite thing by capitalizing the various shades and the middle ground and concealing the differences of the two opposite extremes in the end. Here, the fact that there is a continuous and gradual differentiation of the elements in the middle ground is used to raise doubt regarding the real difference between the opposite extremes. When one argues that no useful distinction can be made between two extremes just because there is no definable moment or point where the two extremes meet. The name of this fallacy comes from the hip paradox in philosophy, using a man's beard as an example. At what point does a man go from clean-shaven to having a beard? A person uses the argument of the beard when he argues that if a car can accommodate 5 persons, why can't it accommodate one more? And if it can accommodate 6, why can't it accommodate one more? After all, one additional load will not make much difference. And of course, this argument can go on until you will have 25 or 35 persons seated snugly inside the car because one more additional load will not make a big difference. Just because accommodating one person makes no apparent difference, there is a difference that becomes more noticeable as the number of those persons being accommodated increase. The next fallacy is called the straw man. The fallacy of the straw man is basically a counter-argument. Here, the arguer misrepresents or misinterprets the opponent's position by exaggeration or distortion with the view of an easier attack. In effect, the arguer is attacking a straw man, an effigy of the enemy, instead of the real enemy. A strawman fallacy is where one exaggerates someone's argument and uses this exaggeration as a way of disproving one's original argument without actually paying attention to the original argument raised. Here's an example. For our premise 1, we have advertisement for beer encourage underage drinking. For our premise 2, underage drinking often has negative consequences. For our conclusion, therefore, advertisement for beer should be banned from TV. An opponent's position is misrepresented to make it easier to critique. It occurs when opponent's position is presented in a way that resembles the original claim but it is not the actual claim. It creates an illusion that a position has refuted or critiques switching out the original position with the different one. The next type of fallacy is slippery slope. This happens when one objects to and criticizes a particular action with the reason that once such an action is performed, it will simply lead unavoidably to a similar yet unpleasant action, which again will lead to an even more undesirable action, and so on, sliding down the slippery slope until the unknown horrors lurking at the bottom will be the ultimate fate. It occurs when someone makes a claim about a series of events that would lead to one major event, usually a bad event. In this fallacy, a person makes a claim that one event leads to another event and so on until we come to some awful conclusion. Along the way, each step or event in the faulty logic becomes more and more improbable. For example, if we enact any kind of gun control laws, the next thing you know, we won't be able to have any guns at all. When that happens, we won't be able to defend ourselves against the terrorist attacks. And when that happens, terrorists will take over our country. Therefore, gun control laws will cause us to lose our country to terrorists. Next, we have the fallacy of diversion. Perhaps all high school and college students have done this fallacy in one of their essay tests or graded recitations before. Diversion means wandering from the main point or going away from the subject matter. This is what they do when their professor asks them a question whose answer they do not know and they start to reply lengthy regarding some related things that they know. Hence, if your physics professor asks you about the theory of relativity, try talking about the life story of Albert Einstein or of the invention of the atomic bomb. But no matter how nicely you have proven a related issue, and no matter how close this related issue may be to the main point, still you have not proven the main point. This fallacy occurs when the meanings of terms or phrases are changed intentionally or unintentionally within the argument, or when our attention is purposely or accidentally diverted from the issue at hand. For example, politicians resort to the fallacy of diversion during a political campaign. Instead of proving to the people his capabilities, his integrity, and sense of leadership, he spends his time talking about what he thinks the people would like to hear. Promises, smear campaign, tales about the movie stars, sentimental or flattering stories, and even a vocal duet with his wife. This fallacy consists in diverting attention from the real issue by focusing instead on an issue having only a surface relevance to the first. Rhetoric and the skill to move from one topic to another are the key to the persuasive fallacy of diversion. Next is begging the question. In this famous drawing of the optical illusionist M.C. Escher, we can trace the water falling from a ledge flowing to the right, then left, then right, then left, and then down to the ledge again. The fallacy of begging the question behaves similarly. It uses a premise or as a premise the conclusion that it intends to prove. It uses as a premise the conclusion that it intends to prove. When you base your argument on something which itself is not secured, your argument will not be sound. The fallacy of begging the question is committed when reasoning is circular in that the conclusion is already assumed in the premises. It occurs when an argument's premises assume the truth of the conclusion instead of supporting it. In other words, you assumed without proof the stand or position or a significant part of the stand that is in question. Begging the question is also called arguing in a circle. For example, I am confident that God exists because it says so in the Bible, and the Bible contains God's Word. Next, we have appeal to ignorance. The fallacy of the appeal to ignorance occurs when we assume that in a certain dispute, the failure to prove one side is a ground to conclude the truth of the other side. The fact that we cannot prove that creatures from outer space do not exist clearly doesn't mean that we can logically conclude that they exist. Theologians and scientists cannot prove that there is God, yet such a failure doesn't mean that we can say there is no God. The fallacy of appeal to ignorance is committed when it is argued that a proposition is true simply on the basis that it hasn't been proven false, or that it is false because it hasn't been proven true. The next type of logical maneuver is contradictory assumption. As suggested by the name itself, this fallacy happens whenever one presents an argument that contains two assumptions which simultaneously cannot be true. This is a fallacy because our ignorance of how to prove or disprove a proposition doesn't necessarily establish either its truth or falsehood. Politicians use this fallacy when they promise the people that they will cut the taxes in half and double all government services. The next type of logical maneuver is contradictory assumption. As suggested by the name itself, this fallacy happens whenever one presents an argument that contains two assumptions which simultaneously cannot be true. This is a fallacy because our ignorance of how to prove or disprove a proposition doesn't necessarily establish either its truth or falsehood. Politicians use this fallacy when they promise the people that they will cut the taxes in half and double all government services. A contradiction is a logical incompatibility between two or more statements or propositions. It occurs when those statements or propositions taken together yield a falsehood. By extension, outside logic, contradictions are also said to occur between actions for which the motives are held to be contradictory, or between beliefs or principles when their content is contradictory. Say for instance this statement, "Hi, I'm Dr. John Smith. I am a specialist in all sorts of diseases and illnesses." When we say specialist, it refers to a person who concentrates primarily on a particular subject or activity. But in this statement, he said that he is a specialist in all sorts of diseases and illnesses, which is actually contradictory. Next, we have two wrongs make a right. This fallacy is committed whenever one tries to justify an admittedly faulty action by charging whoever accuses him with a similar wrong. The fallacy of two wrongs make a right is based on the assumption that if others are doing a similar thing, our wrong deeds are justified or made tolerable. Example: if Americans accuse us of the countless human rights violations in the country, we think the counter-accusation, "How about you? Don't you practice abortion?" settles the issue. If you try to justify an act by pointing out in others a similar act, You are committing the fallacy of two wrongs make a right. This fallacy can occur by suggesting, if others are doing it, I can too. Another form of the fallacy occurs when you dismiss a criticism of your action because your critic is acting in a similar way. Lastly, we have lifting out of context. It is true that words have their own proper meanings, yet when used in language, their intended meanings do not only depend on each of them. In language, meaning is not determined only by each of the meanings of each particular word. In language, the meaning of a word is modified by the neighboring words, and the sense of a sentence is modified by the neighboring sentences and paragraphs. When one indiscriminately cuts a word or group of words away from their original context, there is a possibility that you will end up distorting its meaning or sense. Let's take this conversation as an example. Can you believe that the president said fat people are losers? Where did you hear this? I read it in a headline on Breitbart News. He actually said, people who say fat people are losers are not only cruel, but they are also wrong as well as being irrational. Removing a passage from its surrounding matter in such a way as to distort its intended meaning. In this example, David fell for the clickbait, a technique used by the media to get people to click their links or discuss their article. He did not bother to investigate the context from which the quote was taken, and he perpetuated the lie. These are the types of logical maneuvers.